Welcome to Old News. My name is Martha Fisk, and I'll be your guest host today. I'll keep an eye on the chat for any questions or comments that you would like for us to pass on to Christian. And once again, we have a really fun and interesting topic for you all. We are talking about the Ankylosaur song, and Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology, is here to tell us all about it. So I'm going to pass off the mic to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Martha. Yeah. So I'm excited to talk about a topic I think that is sort of more in the speculative realm than maybe things that we usually present on this show, but I think is something that really sort of captures the imagination, which is what were ancient soundscapes like. So a lot of our work as paleontologists has to do with sort of, known aspects of shape and form. Like, here's a bone, it looks like this. But what about, what's going on in terms of noises animals were making, sort of aspects of their paleobiology, how they were really living? Because we are trying to think of extinct organisms not just as basically rocks that we can catalog as fossils nowadays, but how they were as, living, breathing organisms in their time. And they must have been making noises of some kind. We know from the modern world that many animals at least do. But figuring out sort of what that was can be difficult. So there are, some cases where we can make pretty robust inferences. Like for example, especially if we have modern representatives of these groups, like we can look at fossil crickets and see that they have the same series of little bumps on their legs that crickets use to, make their fiddling, their chirping noises, and say, oh, these animals probably also made cricket noises. But when it comes to groups that do not have good modern analogs, so that have changed a lot in the intervening however many million years, it gets more difficult indeed. And that's certainly the case for the Mesozoic dinosaurs, so the non-avian dinosaurs. There's been no shortage of fictionalized accounts in movies and TV of what dinosaurs wanted to sound like. You can't have, just totally silent Jurassic Park. They need to be doing something, if only to make them seem scarier. But what's sort of the scientific basis for dinosaur sound? And that's actually something that there's been some data on, but remarkably little. But to frame this and to talk about the new discovery that's been made in this arena, we kind of need to talk about where animal sound comes from. So let me pull up some screen for you here. So first, just show you an X-ray image of a modern sound-producing organism, which is ourselves, the humans. So as you can see in this X-ray, it's showing a person speaking. So this is something that's very common in linguistic research, is trying to figure out actually the physical background for the different noises that humans make. The first thing you'll notice is that the tongue and the lips are moving. And yes, this is how, humans make sound. So this is how we're actually modulating the noises that originate down in the throat. So if you look lower down in the X-ray, you'll see there's some darker areas that are in motion. So those are the edges of cartilages. And then there's also a sort of hooked or curved object, which is a bone in the throat called the hyoid. And these are what's called the voice box or the larynx. So you look at a cross section through a human head and the throat, there's this structure I've highlighted here called the larynx, which is a combination of various connective tissues and cartilages that's sort of near the beginning of the esophagus and the trachea, so the tubes that we use to eat and breathe. And the larynx is attached to this bone called the hyoid, which is the only bone in the human body that isn't attached to any other bones. It just sort of like floats loose in the throat and then is attached by these ligaments to the cartilages of the voice box. And basically the combination of motion of this bone and then muscles associated with this set of cartilages is what produces the noise that we modulate in the mouth, and then is basically most of the noises that we use to communicate. So the basis for human speech. So the larynx is highly specialized in primates and in humans in particular. And we have, I'd say, not to be too full of ourselves, we have pretty remarkable vocal capabilities. If you listen to any opera singer, we'll show you that. But humans are by far not the only group of animals that with vocal production in the larynx. Larynx is common to many land vertebrates. And so, for example, like here's an alligator, and you can see that there is the larynx highlighted there, basically in the same position as in humans. So in the throat, at the top of where the esophagus and the trachea start. And alligators are certainly very vocal animals in and of themselves. So they can make things like bellowing. So you hear that bellow, which is, can be very frightening from an alligator. They can also make chirping, especially when they're smaller. You can hear those little chirps as well. So all of this comes, from sound production in the larynx. And so in reptiles like the alligator, so they generally have two distinct sets of cartilages making up sort of the core of the larynx. They have this kind of arched pair called the arytenoid cartilages, and then this larger, more plate-like base called the cricoid cartilage, and then they're surrounded by various muscles and ligaments. In alligators, they also have a much sort of broader, more kind of dish-like hyoid bone than in humans. Humans have this very sort of like horseshoe-shaped, very simplified hyoid bone, which is typical of mammals, but it can be much larger in a lot of reptiles. And in some other groups, it's also used not only in sound production, but also in depressing sort of the throat region to expand basically the throat and maybe sort of suction feed in some cases. So things like turtles, and then going down into amphibians and fishes have this hyoid or hyomandibular depression that's used in feeding as well sometimes as in sound production. So basically you have the same, homologue, so the same kind of core of bony and cartilaginous elements shared between a lot of these vertebrate groups, so in the larynx, which are used in sound production. So the question is, with dinosaurs, I think alligator bellows are often used as sort of stand-ins for dinosaur noise, at least in cases where there's any sort of scientific background for it. There are a lot of cases where it's just like, let's make it roar like a lion, or have something scary if it wants to be like a horror movie or something. But of course, there are living dinosaurs today in the form of birds, and birds, for the most part, don't sound like we imagine dinosaurs to. So what's going on there? How did that transition occur? So if you look at a bird, so here is a juvenile bird with its mouth being held open, and you can see that they also have a larynx at the top of the throat. So that the sort of like paired swollen structure at the back of the throat there is what is visible externally of the avian larynx. And yet birds are not using the larynx to produce their sound. They have evolved a completely different sort of structure and means of producing sound than even in relatively close relatives like the alligator. Birds instead have a structure called the syrinx, which is the basis for their sound production. So syrinx means, it's the Greek word meaning the panpipe, and they have kind of a similar sort of thing going on. So basically they have a series of cartilages with little holes between them at the base of the windpipe. So rather than up at the top of the throat at the beginning of the windpipe in the esophagus, this is a structure sort of before the trachea diverges between the two lungs. And because of this, they're actually producing sound from both of these openings. So something that birds can do that we really can't is actually produce two different sounds at once, or produce sounds only from one side and then a different tone in the other side. So you can see in this animation here, what's happening as to produce bird song. So they can have different basically cartilages and muscles activating to open up different passages in the airways to produce bird song. And of course, bird song is extremely varied between species and, highly capable of things even like mimicry. So like when a parrot mimics human speech, it's actually doing so with sounds from the syrinx, mimicking what we're doing with the larynx. So there is convergence there as well, but the syrinx is capable of things that purely laryngeal vocalization can't be. So thinking about where this begins in the fossil record, unfortunately, all of these things, I've mentioned time and time again, oh, these are the cartilages, these are the muscles, these are the ligaments. These are not things that fossilize well. So we have a very, very poor fossil record for most of these structures. We have, in some cases, go tens of millions of years without any record of any of these things. The earliest record we currently have for the syrinx, so syrinx is common to basically all modern birds. And the earliest fossil record, though, is in the late Cretaceous. This is an animal called Vagavis from the late Cretaceous of Antarctica, actually. And it's a very early member of the group of birds that includes modern sort of ducks and geese, and also like various fowl, so like chickens and quails and pheasants and things. So the fossils of Vagavis are, well preserved, and they're in this block that has been pretty exhaustively CT scanned. And one thing that they found at the base of the neck were these remnants of the syrinx, so the tubes of cartilage surrounding the windpipe that is present in the syrinx of modern birds. So this shows that by the Cretaceous, at least, birds had a syrinx. And this is something, again, that we should expect based on their phylogeny, based on their family tree. So if all these modern groups have the syrinx, their ancestors should share it as well. But it's nice to have confirmation of that in the fossil record. What does that mean for dinosaurs, though? So Vagavis is already like pretty clearly something we'd call a bird. It's a member of modern bird groups. We expect it to have a syrinx. So we haven't found any syrinx fossils in non-avian dinosaurs. But we also haven't found much, soft parts from the throat, sound-producing structures of any kind in early dinosaurs. That is until very recently. So there was a paper that just came out, also on a Cretaceous fossil, but on one that decidedly is not a bird. It's from this animal Panachosaurus, that actually sheds a lot of light on this issue. So Panachosaurus is an Ankylosaur. These are one of these very heavily armored dinosaurs with club tails. So Panachosaurus is found in the late Cretaceous of the Gobi Desert, mostly in Mongolia, and is known actually from a lot of fossils, one of the most abundant ankylosaurs known, including from good growth series. So there are lots of little baby Panachosaurs known, as well as large adults. And really some spectacular preservation in these things as well. So a lot of the Gobi fossils are known for really high quality bone preservation. But the one that was just described is also notable for showing some morphological features, some features of the anatomy that had never been seen before. And so if you look at the figure marked A in sort of the upper left there, this is looking at the underside of the skull and the throat of this Panachosaurus. And what you see there's these sort of like triangular bones kind of in the middle of it. And this is actually a fossilized larynx. So in this animal, it seems the larynx was ossified. That means that it had stopped being fully cartilaginous and had turned into bone. So this is something, that happens a lot in development. A lot of our bones originate as cartilages and then have bone deposited, called ossification. This can also happen to structures that are otherwise fully cartilaginous. So in some birds actually have bony larynges. It seems that was the case in this dinosaur. So this gives us the first really good view of what a dinosaur's voice box would have looked like. And you can see they've reconstructed this using CT scans in the bottom right. So you have those same structures that I showed you before in the alligator. You have that cricoid cartilage in purple and those arytenoid cartilages in green. So you also have the hyoid bones in blue that are associated with it. And so it's really quite a large and plate-like structure. And, you can see the size of the larynx compared to the rest of the skull. It's pretty big. So what does this mean in terms of can this tell us what noises dinosaurs made? Well, if you think about sort of how this would have functioned in the throat, and it's just shown in this illustration here, showing sort of where it would have fit into the living dinosaur. It can tell us a few things. So it doesn't, we can't just instantly analyze it and say, oh, this is the exact noise that this ankylosaur made. But we can look at it in the context of the evolution of this group of reptiles, the archosaurs, so crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds, and make some pretty strong inferences about what might have been happening. So there are a lot of features of the larynx which make it seem a lot more similar to birds than even other archosaurs like the alligator. So one thing you'll note is that those arytenoid cartilages, the ones in green, are quite large. They're elongated and broadened. They would have been capable of sort of moving by a joint. So not these sort of narrow arches as in the alligator. So you also have that very expanded sort of triangular cricoid. And the fact that they're ossifying at all is something that's seen in birds, but not necessarily in earlier reptiles. So all in all, it seems like it had a larynx more similar to birds than to alligators or turtles or lizards or anything. So looking at the proportions and sort of the anatomy of all the parts of the larynx, it also falls in kind of as an end member. It's way out on the chart because this is from this giant kind of living tank. It shouldn't be expected to be exactly the same as a sparrow, but it's within the bird space, within the part of these plots. So birds at the top, reptiles at the bottom, where sound production is happening outside of the larynx and is being modulated by the larynx. So even though birds are producing sound in the syrinx, the larynx is still used, much like our lips and tongue are used to modulate sound as they're singing. So altogether, this suggests that the ankylosaurs were making noise in some way similar to birds. Does this mean that they had a syrinx yet? This, unfortunately, we don't know, and will require further exceptionally preserved discoveries to really figure out where syringeal vocalization originates. With that said, though, I think it can maybe sort of put some other discoveries about dinosaur sound in greater context. So there have been some studies in the past looking at sort of what noises dinosaurs could have made in regard to this group, the hadrosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs. Particularly, there's a subgroup of them that have these really sort of ridiculous crests that are made up of bones of the nose mostly, so like the nasal bones that extend back through the skull. And the nasal passage, as you can see in these kind of cutout views of the skull shown here, curls all the way up through the top of the crest and then back down to actually enter the throat and the windpipe. And various paleontologists have suggested that this was somehow used in vocalization, even making direct reference to this Renaissance era instrument, the crumhorn, which is similar in shape to some of these things like Parasaurolophus. as well, more seriously, as to structures in some extant birds. Like there's the sternum of the whistling swan, shown on the right there, in which sort of the trachea is coiled up inside around the breastbone of this bird, and that alters the noises that it makes. And paleontologists have even gone so far as to both build physical representations out of metal of the Hadrosaurian passage, as well as to make computer models of this, such that there have been, as you'll hear it right now, this is one possibility of noises Parasaurolophus could have made just by forcing air through that style of crest. So the question now, though, is if these dinosaurs had avian-style larynges, what sort of modulation could have been occurring there? And this is where I think another issue with Ankylosaurs becomes very interesting. So from CT scans of Ankylosaur skulls, they don't have these elaborate crests, but we know that they had incredibly complex nasal passages. It almost looks like, a twisty straw going through from between the nostril and then down to the throat. So you can see in the CT scan reconstruction in the bottom how the really kind of wild approach that air would have to take into the skull. So this is something that I think we've mentioned on Old News before. And at the time, one of the things that was suggested was that these were living in desert environments and just basically needed to moisturize dry air as it was coming in, which is something that mammals do very well, but it's a little more difficult for reptiles. However, the discovery of this larynx, I think, raises another possibility, which is that even though they weren't showing it as outwardly as the hadrosaurs, their complex nasal passages may also have been involved in either producing, modulating noises, and maybe even these, sort of, it's not like these are not the most elegant of dinosaurs. I don't want to put them down, but Ankylosaurs, they are kind of like living tanks. They're not graceful, but maybe they could have been singing just as beautifully as the hadrosaurs, or even as some birds today. So I think we shouldn't be judging all these dinosaurs on their appearances. For all we know, Tyrannosaurus wouldn't have been roaring at prey or even bellowing necessarily. Could have been making clacking noises like a stork, or chirps like a baby crocodile or something. There, like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of room for speculation in this field, but it really, I think it's amazing to see some hard evidence in the form of these rarely fossilized structures finally starting to appear and letting us at least narrow our field of speculation a little bit, and perhaps at some point in the future we'll even know with some degree of rigor the sound that at least a few species of dinosaurs would have been able to make.
Thanks. It really is just so fascinating to think about what dinosaurs could have actually sounded like instead of what we pretend to think that they might have,
Yeah, we project a lot of our expectations to, and what we know of the anatomy, a lot of that is pretty clearly wrong.
Yes. And one of the things that I was thinking of was if it did live in a desert environment, and thinking of birds again and how the sounds that they make, and birds that live in a forest with lots of trees make very different sounds than birds that live in a marsh habitat, right? There's more of the really high pitched versus low, rumbly or more repetitive sounds, if that makes sense. Yeah.
A lot of thrumming among marsh birds.
Thrumming, yeah. So maybe the Ankylosaur is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, anything in the desert also, I would think they would want sound to carry a far distance. I don't think so. They are abundant, but a lot of the cases where we have multiple pinacosaurs together, it doesn't necessarily seem like they were a herd, but they may have been sort of mass death assemblages where they were sort of forced together. Heavily armored animals generally aren't as frequently seen in sort of large accumulation because if they have that much armor, they can afford to be solitary. But if they were trying to find other members of their species during the mating season or something, they might be widespread. I mean, this is getting into some really speculative stuff, but just thinking from the biology of modern animals, if they were in that environment. So probably would want like lower frequency sounds that could really carry far.
My next follow-up thought is that maybe this is an assignment for all of our viewers, is the next time you watch some kind of dinosaur documentary or cartoon or movie, think to yourself where those dinosaur sounds are coming from, like what animal they're being replicated from, and then like how that might change over time, right, as we learn more and find more evidence. So it's kind of a fun thought for us to part with today, right?
Yeah. And it's a lot of mammals, just because, we are most familiar, I think, with mammals as potential threats to us. Right. So like when we want a T-Rex or an Allosaurus or whatever kind of carnivorous dinosaurs in these movies, we want something that will sort of frighten us. And if it's making even like there are certainly very formidable birds of prey today, but if sort of a red-shouldered hawk cry you saw coming out of a Tyrannosaurus, I think people might laugh at it. Say, well, that's weird.
I mean, the bald eagle, right? When the bald eagle soars across the prairie in the old-fashioned movie, it's not the bald eagle because it sounds like a big chicken. So yeah, you're probably right. Yeah. Well, I think Laura Beth may have mentioned that she was playing bingo, and I hope that some of you were also playing along with bingo and that you hit a lot of the vocabulary words that we included, because there were some really fun ones today, some new terminology for us all to learn. So I think if you have any other fun facts to add before we say goodbye for today, Christian?
Oh, did you have any questions for me about this?
No, I don't see any questions in the chat right now.
All right. Martha, anything that you thought of while I was going through that you might want to adjust here?
So I think maybe this might be another speculative question. So where do you think our next potential fossil evidence for this might come from? What's another hot spot where we might be finding some new evidence of these kinds of adaptations?
So I think for the origin of the syrinx is where like fossil evidence will appear to narrow that down, particularly because we now have such an incredibly diverse and well-sampled set of basically all the steps between sort of raptor-type dinosaurs, so dromaeosaurids and troodonids, and true early birds. So the fossils that have been found in northeastern China, in where all the feathered dinosaurs are from, it's not just that there are feathered dinosaurs there. There are like literally thousands of fossils of these very primitive birds. So to my knowledge, there have not been any discoveries of a syrinx yet, but I think given that like all the plume in a syrinx has to show up if these animals had them. And if not, if they can at least find a windpipe fossilized trachea that doesn't show the syrinx, that also gives us a lot of information of helping us pin down exactly where in the history of this group that showed up. And so once we know that, like if we can say for sure that like Velociraptor didn't have a syrinx, Panachosaurus didn't have a syrinx, that it must have been using sort of laryngeal vocalization, that will help us say, oh, okay, maybe these were, maybe they had started, modulating noises like a bird, but maybe they were still making sounds fundamentally similar to an alligator. So, yeah, I think the feathered dinosaurs still have a lot to teach us about sort of soft tissue anatomy in all of these groups.
So we'll be staying tuned, right?
Oh, always. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month in April.
Yeah, I'm sure more amazing discoveries will have been made by then.
Yes. Looking forward to it.
Yep.
Have a
Thank
great
you very
rest
much,
of your
Martha.
day. Thanks, Christian.
Yeah, you too. Stay safe, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye, everybody.